You're listening to the Trucking True Crime Podcast, a podcast that centers on crimes within the trucking industry. Created by your host, Angela Baum, a teen truck driver and true crime enthusiast. Grab your cup of coffee and join us as we take this over-the-road journey together on today's Trucking True Crime Story.
Welcome back, all my Trucking True Crime fans. I'm so thrilled you decided to join us today. I'm your host, Angela Baum. I'm a full-time truck driver with a passion for trucking and true crime, so I decided to put my two loves together to create this podcast. Before we get on with today's case, if you would please give us a 5-star rating wherever you're currently listening to our podcast out, that helps us out so much. Also, please be sure to visit us on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Growing up, Helene was one of 3 children. She grew up in a very large and loving family. Her parents affectionately referred to her as the baby of the family. Helene Pruszynski was a beautiful young lady who was known for her laughter and her bright personality. She was a young lady who grew up with a real passion for singing. In her high school and college years, she was part of several singing groups and theater groups. She was on the homecoming court, she was a cheerleader, and she was on the honor roll in high school. There is no doubt that Helene was one of the most popular kids in school. There was also no doubt that in her classmates' mind, they knew that Helene was going to grow up and make a big difference in the world. After high school graduation, Helene went off to attend Wheaton College in Massachusetts. Helene had dreamed of becoming a journalism and studying at their journalism program at Wheaton College. As part of her journalism degree, Helene got the opportunity to intern at a radio station. This happened during her senior year in 1979. As a result of this opportunity, she wound up moving to Colorado. Helene was lucky enough that her aunt and uncle also lived in Colorado and lived not far away from that radio station. So they offered her a room in their house so that she could help fulfill her internship. At the radio station, Helene's colleagues said that she was such a professional. She was always looking for ways to improve herself, and she would even ask the other reporters for advice in order for her to learn more and grow within the journalism. It was the night of January 16th, 1980, when Helene disappeared. As the day went on, the weather at the radio station had gotten worse and worse. The weather reports coming in were calling for a large snowfall, and Helene was worried about getting home that night before the snowstorm started, because Helene rode the bus home to her aunt and uncle's house, and she knew that if the snowstorm got bad, that the city buses would stop. So she was hoping that she could leave a little bit early just to make sure that she got home in time. So Helene went and spoke with her boss at the radio station to see if there was any possible way she could leave just a little bit early in hopes of avoiding getting stuck in that awful snowstorm. Her boss agreed, and around 6:30 p.m., Helene decided to walk out to the bus station with a few colleagues. Helene was told by one of her reporter colleagues that if she had waited just 15 minutes, allowed him to finish up what he was doing, that he would give her a ride home to make sure that she got home safely. According to him, he said that he was worried about her getting home safely, especially with an impending snowstorm. Helene thought about the gentleman's offer for a few moments, but in the end, she politely declined and decided that she would instead take the bus with her colleagues. The reporter that had offered Helene the ride said that Helene left to head to the bus station around 6:15 p.m. from the radio station. Helene rode the bus with a few colleagues from the radio station, and they said that they watched her get off at her regular bus stop that night. Now, from the bus stop, Helene's aunt's house was only a few blocks away. She would normally return home by 7 p.m. each night. But when Helene still had not made it home by 8 p.m., Helene's aunt and uncles knew immediately that something was so wrong. Helene was one of the most very punctual girls, and they knew by 8 o'clock and she wasn't home, there was something wrong. After Helene didn't come home after work, her aunt decided to call her work and her colleagues to see if anyone had seen her or maybe knew where she might be. But all of her coworkers said that the last time they saw her was either at the radio station or on the bus. Her aunt immediately contacted the police. She knew that this was not the way Helene was. This was not her personality, and she knew that something was wrong. In spite of the bad weather, Helene was always prompt and predictable. Almost immediately, the police began scouring Inglewood, Colorado in search of Helene. They started at her radio station and they followed the bus routes that would have taken her back to her aunt's house. The reporters and the staff that she worked with at the radio station were among those people searching along with the police. Her coworkers began retracing the path that Helene would have walked from the bus stop to her aunt's house. Then they started driving around the town and around the radio station, but no matter where they went, there were simply no sightings of Helene anywhere, and the weather was slowly getting worse. It's January 17th, 1980, and a mother and her young kids have been spending the day together running errands and getting a few things done for the household. It had been a full day of activities, and all three of them were exhausted and just looking forward to getting home and relaxing and having a little bit of supper. As the young mother drove down the road, she smiled as she looked in the rearview mirror, looking at the side of her children playing and giggling in the back seat. As they were heading home, they started to pass by Daniel's Park when her son in the back seat yelled at his mom. He screamed at her in a way that made her blood run cold. She knew immediately there was something wrong. The little boy said that he thought that he had just seen a body out in the field off on the side of the road. Realizing by the tone of this little boy's scream that her boy probably did indeed see something, the young mother stopped and started to look out into the field for herself. Before too long, the silhouette of what looked like a young woman began to appear. It looked as though she was just out there in the field napping, partially naked. The mother realized that she had to get help and quickly, but they were in a pretty remote and desolate area. And this was a time before cell phones were affordable or available for most people. As she drove down the road just a little bit, she wound up seeing a utility worker on the side of the road with his truck. The young mother parked her truck and ran up to the man and explained to him what she had just seen in the field located behind her. The man immediately got a hold of his company's dispatch, asked them to call the police and have them come out to Daniels Park. The man then got in his truck, turned around, and followed the mother back to the field to see where the body was laying. Sure enough, he too saw the young woman laying out in the field, and it wasn't too much longer before the local police arrived. Once the police arrived and they assessed the crime scene in front of them, they knew that they were going to need additional help as theirs was a very tiny police department. So wisely, they wound up calling the Colorado Bureau of Investigations to help them assist with this case, as homicides was something their police department rarely handled. As police started to assess the crime scene, they saw a young, beautiful, blonde haired woman who was laying in the field. She was naked from the waist down, except for her socks and a top that she had on that was pulled up, exposing her breast. When they began to look at her body for signs of distress or trauma, or to try to figure out why exactly this girl was out here dead in the field, the first thing that came to their minds was that they felt it must have been a sexually motivated crime because of the fact that the woman had no pants, no panties, and her shirt was pulled up. The ground underneath the young woman was still frozen from the snow the night before, and it appeared that she had not been in this field for too long. As they looked over her body, they noticed that both of her hands had been bound behind her back, and there was a cord tied around her neck. When they rolled her over, they also realized that someone had stuck a rag in her mouth as a gag. Underneath her body, as they moved it over, they wound up seeing a very large pool of blood. It was pointing to the fact that this is probably where the crime had occurred. As they looked further on the young woman's body, they wound up seeing a ton of small puncture wounds all over her delicate body. There was too many puncture wounds for the police officers to count. They would have to wait for the coroner to perform their autopsy. They noticed that leading away from the body was a set of footprints. Due to the ground still being partially frozen, they had good prints to work with. As they followed the footprints from the crime scene to the road, they noticed that two sets led to the crime scene and only one set left the crime scene, which meant that she walked into the field on her own. Officers also noted that the set of prints leaving the crime scene looked like they had come from a pair of pointed toe cowboy boots. Police wound up making a cast of these footprints to use down in the future. Police took the evidence that they had gathered and decided to head back to the police station. They wanted to start their investigation and to look into the identity of who this poor young woman was. As they began their investigation, they started going through missing person reports to see if anyone had reported a young blonde missing woman. It was not too long into their search that they came across a missing person report that sounded like it just might be their match. It was a missing person report from a neighboring city called Englewood, Colorado, where a 21-year-old blonde woman named Helene Pruszynski had been reported missing just the night before. Police knew that they needed to reach out to that police department to see if their Jane Doe was possibly that missing woman. Approximately 18 hours after they had started searching, some of the reporters from the radio station returned back to the police station to rest a bit. As they were all gathered around in the police station, the police wound up receiving a phone call from a neighboring town in Douglas County. The police department in Douglas County wound up telling them that they may possibly have a body matching Helene's description in their county. They asked if they could possibly have one of Helene's family or friends come over to Douglas County to possibly see if this was indeed Helene. The police captain at the police department in Englewood wound up going over to one of the reporters and asking if one of them could possibly accompany them to the crime scene. They were needing them to go to make a positive ID. Despite his reluctance, one of the reporters said that he would definitely accompany them. In his gut, though, he knew that this was probably more than likely going to be Helene's body. He did not want to go to the crime scene and identify it, but he knew that he had to. Helene had been the only missing girl in the area, so the chances that this was Helene was very high. So when they found a woman who matched her description, he just knew in the back of his mind that this had to be Helene. As the police officers and the reporters began to walk into the snowy field, the reporter looked down and in shock, he said that yes, the lady laying in the field was indeed Helene. In his opinion, he said it was the most horrifying thing that he had ever done in his entire life. Fear wound up gripping the snowy Colorado community as they began to wonder if there was a murderer in their midst. Murder was something that was so rare of happening in their community. This was a very quiet area, very remote, and the community began to be very scared. As of January 17th, 1980, the coroner began his autopsy to determine Helene's cause of death. The coroner took great care to help preserve the evidence, such as her clothing, which was a priority for him. In the case, DNA evidence was present on her clothing. They assumed that it was semen, so they made sure to get good samples of it. According to the coroner, Helene was stabbed 9 times in the back. The stab wounds wound up puncturing her lungs. Her blood loss was so severe that she essentially bled to death out in that field. Helene's coroner was also able to confirm that she had also been sexually assaulted like the police had thought. They wound up finding dried seminal fluid on her body and on some of her clothes. Their first assumption that this was a crime of passion, and they suspected that Helene might possibly know the person that killed her. But there was one problem with their theory. Helene had just moved to town only a few weeks ago to start her internship. Helene really didn't know anybody besides her coworkers at the radio station and her aunt and uncle. So the chances of it being a crime of passion was probably not a probable theory. In her 2 weeks that she had been in Colorado, most of her time had been spent enjoying time with her aunt and uncle, getting to know them, reminiscing with them, or going back and forth to the radio station for work. So when police began to investigate Helene's personal life, sadly, they were unable to find a real person of interest within her immediate circle. Everybody at Helene's radio station had an alibi, and her aunt and uncle were at home that night. So now the police were stuck at point one. Who do they look at now? Helene's radio station decided that they wanted to try to help because they were afraid that Helene's case was starting to lose momentum within Colorado. So they decided that they wanted to offer a reward and hoping that it might generate new leads to help solve Helene's case. So Helene's radio station, KHOW, wound up offering a $10,000 reward for any information. They would even run commercials urging people to help call in tips to help solve the case. An interesting tip wound up coming in from a woman who said that on January 16th, around 10 p.m., as she was driving by Daniels Park, she had seen a suspicious looking man at that same location where Helene's body was found. She said she was driving home after her work. She worked as a waitress at a local restaurant when she saw a man parked off on the side of the road. She said he had his four-ways on and he was kneeling down at the back of his car, looking like maybe he had car trouble. She said that when she passed him, the look that he gave her sent chills down her spine. The police helped her make a sketch of what the possible suspect looked like, using a crime scene sketch and also hypnosis. However, nothing ever came of that sketch, and police were never able to find a possible suspect matching that description. The leads in Helene's case started to dry up, and the case became a cold case. Helene's friends and family began to believe that her case would never be solved. Then in 1984, everything changed. In Jacksonville, Florida, two men accused of killing hundreds of women claimed that they also had killed Helene. It was therefore necessary for the Colorado police to go down to investigate them. The two men were Otis Toole and Henry Lee Lucas. They claimed that during their killing spree, that the police were able to find evidence that the two men had indeed been in Colorado around the same time that Helene had also been in Colorado. So the police felt that maybe this was a viable lead. The two men, though, when they went down to interview them, were only giving them information that had been readily available in the newspaper. There was no information that they were giving to the police that truly pointed to the fact that they had indeed killed Helene. This was information that anyone could have gotten just by reading the local newspaper articles. When police began to grill them a little bit further in regards to how Helene was killed, Otis Toole made a mistake by saying, "Yeah, we shot her in the head." Police paused because they knew that Helene had only been stabbed in the back. She had never been shot. The investigators knew that they were now back at square one, and traveling to Florida to pursue this lead had been a big waste of time. Otis Toole and Henry Lee Lucas had lied and made up this entire story. Due to a lack of leads, Helene's case officially became a cold case. But Helene's friends from school and her family kept pressing the police to keep the investigation open. They wanted to make sure that they were keeping an open investigation and still looking for the killer of Helene. Because she'd only been living in Colorado for 2 weeks, family and friends believed that there really wasn't any good suspects for them to look at, but they were hoping that the police would still continue to look. As a result, Helene's childhood friends began handing out flyers to people all within the Colorado community, hoping that maybe this would spark the news stations to start to post about Helene's story and to possibly keep the interest open about her story. They were hoping that passing out the flyers and contacting the radio stations that it might possibly generate some new leads and maybe spark some people's memories. Sadly, all of their hard work came to an end with absolutely no leads or no more information coming in. They wound up setting up a website also to try to generate some more leads, but sadly, no new leads wound up coming in through their website either. Finally, in January of 2015, a new sheriff wound up taking over, and he decided that he was going to set up a cold case unit in his department. He wound up taking some police officers who had retired and some ones that were close to retirement to set up the cold case unit. He wanted them to start looking into some of the cold cases that they had in their files, and one of those was going to be Helene's case. DNA technology had come so far from 2015 to 1980 that he was hoping that maybe the DNA tools that they now had available to them could help the cold case unit and the police detectives to possibly come up with a new DNA match and possibly come up with some new suspects in their case. The cold case crime unit wound up using ancestry sites like 32andMe and Ancestry.com and GED Match, as well as genetic DNA testing, using the DNA that they had on file from Helena's case. Using the DNA samples that they had on file, they began to attempt to build a genealogy tree. This took them several years to try to compile this tree. Finally, after compiling their tree, they believed that they had found the mother of the person who possibly killed Helene. In March in 2019, 36 years after Helene had been murdered, they discovered that the mother had several children. According to public records, it showed that she had daughters and no sons. Well, that didn't make much sense because they knew that the person who killed Helene was a man. So they couldn't understand how the mother of their murder suspect only had daughters. This didn't make any sense to them at all. In order to confirm that they were on the right family tree, they wound up starting to collect DNA from the family members of this woman. Each of the sample proved that they were looking at the right person. As they began to speak with relatives of this woman, they found out that she had actually given birth to two sons at one point, but she had given up both of the sons for adoptions. They wound up looking through old new newspaper articles to try to see if there was anything in the paper in regards to the woman or possibly her sons or any of the adoption process. And they came across an article about a reunion between a mother and her adopted son. As they researched his mother a little further, it seemed that it was 33 years after she'd given up her son for adoption that she wound up finding him and reuniting with him. That same article also mentioned that her son, whom she had met a few years had that same article also mentioned that she had also met her other son that she had given up for adoption just a few years earlier. So now police had the name of both of her sons that she had given up for adoption. As they searched the name of both of the sons, they realized that they could eliminate one of the sons completely since they already had his DNA on file in the criminal database. Helene's crime scene DNA did not match his. So this led investigators to believe that the other son was responsible for Helene's murder. The name of that other son was Curtis Allen White. He had been convicted of rape before in 1980 and had gone to prison for it. After serving a short sentence for this rape, only a few months, he was sent to the Colorado area, and he was there around the same time that Helene was there doing her internship and was murdered. Based on the fingerprints of Curtis Allen White, they were able to identify him as James Curtis Clanton from Florida. Police were shocked when they received the booking photos from James' 1988 arrest for domestic violence. Just days after Helene's body was found, if you remember, that lady had created a composite sketch of a man that she had seen on the side of the road by Daniels Park that she said looked very suspicious. Well, that composite sketch that she created and the booking photo of James Curtis Clanton from his 1988 arrest for domestic violence looked exactly alike. As a result, they knew that the person that they were looking for was Curtis Allen White, but he had been going by James Clanton. They were one and the same person. He was an over the road truck driver. James lived in a very small rural town in Florida and had been an over the road truck driver for over 23 years. Police knew that they had to fly to Florida to conduct an undercover sting in hopes of obtaining his DNA for comparison just to make sure that they definitely had the right person. Over the next few days after police arrived in Florida, they wound up following him everywhere that he went for days, hoping that he would discard something that they could use for DNA comparison. They wound up following his pattern. As soon as he gets out of bed in the morning, he hops into his semi truck. He leaves for the day and he gets home around 4 p.m. and stays in his house for the rest of the night. It seemed that it was going to be impossible to get this man's DNA because they could never find him throwing away or discarding anything. But one night they got a break. James decided that he was going to go out to a local bar with some friends and have a few beers. As James sat at the bar for a few hours enjoying his drinks and chit chatting with some of his friends, he wound up deciding to call it a night and wound up heading out the door to head back home. As James walked out of the bar, a couple of police detectives and plainclothes wound up running into the bar and telling the waitress that they needed to grab his beer glasses before she had an opportunity to clean them. They were very lucky that they were able to grab the beer glasses, take them off the countertop, and send them in to do for DNA comparison. Just a few days later, they wound up getting their results back on the beer glass that they had gotten from the bar, and they wound up finding that it was a positive match between the beer mugs and the DNA that they found on Helene's clothes. Helene's killer was now 100% identified. 11 days after getting that DNA match result back from the beer glasses, they wound up going to James's house out in the middle of Florida to arrest him. They wound up trying to convince James that they were wanting to talk to him about a security fraud case that they were working on out of Colorado. They didn't want to tip him off that they were actually wanting to talk to him about Helene's murder. They were trying to they were trying to trick him into giving them some information. Therefore, they told him that they wanted to interview him at the police station, and they asked if he could follow him down to the local police station in Florida. As a result, James decided he'd go down and try to help them with his security frauds case, and he headed down to the police station. Immediately after the police began starting the questioning with James, he wound up asking the police if he should call his trucking dispatch company to let them know whether or not he would be able to go to work the next day. Police tried to sidestep that question because obviously they knew that he was not going to be able to go to work the next day. And so they kept saying, James, if you'll just answer a few of our questions, then we'll let you go. But he kept asking them, am I going to be released today? I need to let my trucking company know. And eventually they tell them exactly why they are there, that they are there to discuss Helene's 1980 homicide case. And it was at that point that James's face turned white. They wound up taking a photo of Helene's body laying out in the field and putting it right underneath James's face. James took a good look at it and realized exactly why the police were there. As a result, he tells the police that he thinks he needs an attorney and he stops talking with the police completely. The police let him know that that was okay, that that was his right, but that they did have a warrant out for Helene's murder, so they were going to be taking him back to Colorado. That is at that point that he tells them, you have the wrong man. Until one of the investigators tells them, James, we have your DNA. We know that we have the right person. And it was at that point that James went silent. He knew that the jig was up. A few days later, the investigators from Colorado wound up boarding a plane with James to extradite him back to Colorado, where he was going to be charged with first-degree murder in the case of Helene. As the three gentlemen were on the small plane riding back to California, the investigators wound up asking him exactly what happened back there in that night of 1980. Luckily, the investigators were smart enough that they had set up a hidden camera to make sure that they caught the entire conversation as they were flying on the plane. The investigators asked him, hey, James, the night of Helene's murder, do you know by chance, were you possibly wearing cowboy boots? James shook his head yes and said, yeah, probably. That's about all I wore back in the 1980s. The investigators also asked him what made him choose Helene. Why was she the perfect target for you? And James said that it was simply fate. He said that he saw Helene get off the bus that night as the snow began to fall, and he decided to walk up behind her. That's when he wound up forcing a knife into the side of her and told her just to keep on walking. As they rounded a corner, he wound up taking her purse strap, tied it around her hands and then her back, and throwing her into the back of his truck. Helene turned to James and asked him why he was doing this to her, and James said that he was only going to kidnap her and rape her, but that he would release her. Helene explained to him that her family wasn't wealthy and they had no money to pay any ransom. And James assured her that he would release her once he was finished with her. When investigators asked him if he had ever raped or murdered another woman before or after Helene, James said he never had. He said that Helene was killed because he hated women. He said that unfortunately this innocent girl was the target of this man's rage. In James's mind, he felt that women were to blame for everything bad that had ever happened to him in his life. And on that particular night, he had been drinking and just decided that he would take out his rage and hatred of women on this poor innocent woman. That was the only excuse that James ever gave for the reasons on why he decided to kill Helene. In a Colorado courtroom in February 21st of 2020, James Clanton wound up pleading guilty to the murder of Helene. By him pleading guilty, this allowed her family to avoid a long and lengthy trial. James Clanton was sentenced to life in prison, but he will be eligible for parole in just 20 years from 2020. crazy case. It took almost 40 years for them to find out who wound up killing this poor woman, and she was only killed because of his hatred towards other women. So sad. Anyway, I want to thank you guys so much for listening to this latest podcast episode. I've got another one lined up for you guys next week. It's going to be a doozy of a story as well. Please be sure to give us a 5-star rating wherever you're listening to. And please be sure to also visit us on our Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram page, where I'll be posting photos of Helene and James Clayton so you can see what they look like up on our Facebook and Instagram. All right, all my roadies, as always, please be safe out there on those roads, and we'll see you back here next week.
Thank you so much for listening to Trucking True Crime Podcast. Please be sure to give us a 5-star rating wherever you're listening from. Don't forget to check out our latest merchandise line. And lastly, consider getting a monthly subscription with the Trucking True Crime Podcast to help support this great podcast. Be safe out there, my roadies.